I welcome all participants at this magnificent hall. I wish all participants who are online would be able to see this home church of the Sheremetev Palace. I'm welcoming everyone who has joined us online. First, the history of this event, why Romolo and I are here today before you. We used to do a similar format about a year ago at the St. Petersburg Forum of Culture, and the head of the development department of the Theatrical Museum, who is hosting us here today, attended that meeting between Romolo and myself, and we decided to do it once again so that you, our participants, could join us offline and online, because during this totalitarian online mode, it would be very nice to have some people offline, seeing the faces, hearing the questions. It was also important for Romolo. Why Romolo? I met him several years ago. He's half Italian, half American. He's a sculptor, an artist. He graduated and has taught at Harvard. He is learned in Italy. He creates and teaches in Provincetown, not far away from Boston. By the way, there is an exhibition underway at the Museum of the Arts of the 20th and 21st century. We were planning to have his exhibition for last fall. It had to be postponed till this year. Hopefully, it will take place this year on the same date. In order not to destroy our dream, two works by him are still present at the Beyond the Looking Glass exhibition. There are two works by Romolo. Everybody pays attention to that. I know it from my friends from St. Pete and Moscow. Romolo is a great intellectual, in my view. It's a real great pleasure to have a conversation with him every time I do it. And why me as a host or anchor, I'm trying to do this in interactive way. Romolo and myself are expecting your questions. And dear viewers, you're welcome to send your questions into the chat to the organizers or to myself using whatever messengers. You can use any of them. We've got two questions already now, and it should be quite interesting and interactive. As we were discussing with Romolo the format of this meeting, we knew it would be late January. And since November, during this cycle of lectures going on here, much will have been told about Diaghilev. So we decided to take his figure as an anchor point to talk about the role of a patron in the lives of artists, in the very wide sense of the word. Artists, painters, authors, musicians, whoever, with Diaghilev as a figurehead. It's not about Diaghilev alone. It's about patronage and patrons. We will talk about other patrons in the history. One other thing I forgot to mention, because when you organize an event like this, Romolo doesn't know a single question I'm going to ask of him. We only discussed a general framework with him. Maybe I was not entirely correct in choosing this format, but Romolo and myself have known each other well. So this improvisation moment should be good. Why don't we start? Romolo, my first question to you goes like this. I know that indirectly Diaghilev has had an influence on your life, even personally. Why don't you share with us how Diaghilev did that indirectly on your personal life? Thank you.
Very well. Good morning. Well, good evening to you, Dmitry. And I'd like to thank you, your dear friend, colleague, and cultural diplomat for setting this all up. And before I begin, I'd also like to thank the director of the Sheremetevsky Palace Theater Museum, Natalia Ivanova-Metelitsa, and the head of development, Anna Potapova. Forgive me if I've Italianized your names. Thank you. So, yes, I was also thinking as you were introducing me, that this format where we are improvising would probably to some extent appeal to Diaghilev. He was a great believer in creative energy and creative impetus. He was a fascinating figure because he always desired to control and understand and produce down to the finest detail everything. But on the other side, he was also a great believer in creative, a moment of inspiration. One of the classics of the story of the Ballet Russe and Diaghilev being that when Nijinsky sort of went wild with La Comédie d'Enfants, when they debuted the Afternoon of a Faun in Paris, that his interpretation of that role, his running away with it and falling into becoming the faun, which scandalized Paris in the moment, Diaghilev understood as a fantastic thing. He said, this is a breakthrough. We are changing ballet and theater and art. And he was a great appreciator of improvisation. I think that one of his influences was Stanislav and the school of living in the role. And so he understood how you become invested in being in the moment, as it were. So yes, we are improvising, and I have not answered your question. And I think to back up and say, why am I here? Why am I talking about Diaghilev? And a while ago, I spoke to you about this, and I said, well, in my opinion, I live in a world that Diaghilev created. And that may sound a little far-fetched. Well, I'm not Russian, and I'm not in ballet, and how is this? Well, Diaghilev, in 1913, he put on a performance with Igor Stravinsky's ballet composition, choreographed by Nijinsky, called the Rites of Spring, Le Sacre du Printemps. And this performance, it radicalized the world. When it was performed, it was received with boos. They threw things at the stage. Paris was in an uproar. And you have to understand that the Parisian public, the embracers of the avant-garde, they considered themselves at the time the avatars of culture, the cultural reference point for the entire world of what was and wasn't appropriate in advanced creative thinking. And their response to the Rites of Spring was explosive and at first very negative, and they rejected it. But Diaghilev really had an incredible intuitive sense as part of his entire way of working. He was a fascinating man because on the one hand, he was incredible in the way he created extensive compendiums of artists. He really would go into recording everything and documenting everything. His notes, his notebooks, they were legendary. Before he went into the career of becoming an impresario, before he began producing operas and then later on ballets, he created exhibits, and he pulled from the entire existing known architecture of Russian artists, both the ones of his time, the ones of the past who were looking towards Europe, and the artists who were looking towards traditional Russian art, iconographic art. He assembled all of these artists. He created these huge notebooks. He was exhaustive in his thinking. And so when, to circle back, when he presented the Rites of Spring and when it had such a difficult launch, He had no doubt about what he was doing, about the value of what he was doing. He understood his role to essentially create a map based on what came before for what would come next. And he saw this work as a necessary and important step in the evolution of the arts. So, as we now know, he was correct. This piece of music, the sets, the inspiration that it shared with other artists, not just in Paris and in Russia, but all over the world, the almost fractive quality, the way that it shattered with rhythm and movement, many of the concepts that people had held on to about theater, about ballet, about even the concept of what a dancer was, what a production could be, what a piece of music that should be danced to should evoke. This really seminal work has remained an inflection point in art history, and it informs so many forms of thinking that came afterwards, and not the least that it was certainly influential in my development. I see the advent of the rites of spring as also informing the work of a number of artist movements that were very influential on me as a young artist, like the Vorticists of France and the Futurists of Italy. And I studied this work and I listened to it as I worked, as I developed as an artist. And so it was very natural that 100 years later, in May of 2013, when at my university, they held a concert to celebrate the centennial anniversary of the Rites of Spring, that I should go to this event. I really wanted to, as it were, spend a moment connecting across a century to that point, to that piece of music and what it meant to the art and the artists who came afterwards. And I went there, and for me, I'm not a good audience member for music because I have peculiar habits. And one of my habits is that I love to take my sketchbook. I always have a little black sketchbook and something to draw with. And to listen to music, I have to draw. When I'm doing art, I can hear music differently than if I'm just sitting there. If I'm just sitting there, I'm a prisoner in the seat. But if I have a sketch pad, I'm participating with the musicians. And that is how I like to take in music. And at this particular concert, I had a lovely seat and I'm sitting there drawing. And there was someone sitting next to me. And during an orchestral break, she leaned over and she said, "What are you doing?" And and I said, "I'm drawing." I felt very much, the musicians, they were on the stage. Sanders Theater at Harvard, it was built in the I think the middle part of the 19th century, very much a kind of music box of a theater, all wood, carved, a perfect place to see this turn of the century music, and also acoustically a wonderful place. And I'm drawing these musicians in their tailcoats, and I'm thinking about Diaghilev and his tuxedos and tails and the way that he presented himself, always an extremely formal person. And I felt very much mise en scène. I felt like I was there. I was with him, and the drawing was just a natural connection to what he did. And I would say that looking through the beautiful exhibit at the Sheremetevsky Palace Theater Museum, unfortunately I have to do this virtually, but many of the artworks are these wonderful small sketches that the artists associated with Diaghilev did of the musicians, of the dancers, of the meetings. And I was really channeling this spirit. And so I explained to this lovely lady sitting next to me that this was how I listened to music. And I could tell that this answer to her really required elaboration. However, Stravinsky did not permit it. They moved on to the next movement, and we listened, and I drew, and I thought about what I should say when the curtain came down, and we could talk. And I decided that, all right, I will seize this moment and invite this interested person to a cafe, and we can discuss music and art and drawing and all the other things that flow from this kind of creativity. And I did that. And well, Diaghilev, thank you. Stravinsky, thank you. I married that woman a few years later, but it was a wonderful discussion, which we are still having. And she, like Diaghilev, is a great force of energy and has, like Diaghilev, a wonderful, fascinating, diverse circle of friends. Amongst them, our moderator here today, my now dear friend and colleague, Dmitri. And I have to say that it really, as I was thinking about Diaghilev, as I was thinking about the connections between us, when Dmitri first discussed this with me, I was thinking, yes, of course, I live in Diaghilev's world. He created this for me. His actions, while, you know, he, of course, I'm not being egotistical. I don't mean that he thought of me, but that he thought of all artists. He thought of all creative types, that he was throwing a very important, significant, large stone in the middle of a pond, and those ripples that spread out from that impact of throwing this rites of spring into all of our culture. These waves are still 100 years later impacting artists, touching us, shaping our lives. And now here we are all together and discussing this, and it's still alive. He's still with us. He's still shaping us, shaping our thoughts, shaping events, because of how he worked and how he looked at the arts, because of what he was willing to do for the arts, which is anything he could do. And I would say that this kind of action is what I call grand patronage. And I don't mean by grand patronage that you're talking about incredible sums of money, because there are patrons who have spent more. In fact, Diaghilev really had no money of his own. He was a master at pulling it from sources everywhere else, of drawing other people in to this active, ongoing imagination of his about what art, music, culture, society should be, that he made people invested in what he was doing. So he didn't actually need to have a personal fortune, but others have had personal fortunes and did similar things. And this concept, which we call the grand patronage, is this idea of not just interacting with art and saying, okay, I will give you money and go away and leave me alone, and that's fine, you're an artist, it's nice. But to become one with the artist, to stand shoulder to shoulder with them, to carry the same banner that they're carrying, to be invested in the struggle of creativity. And why should this be important? Well, like I said, he threw this stone into the pond of our culture, and the waves are still touching us. This idea of investment, not just of capital, but of your entire being, of becoming one with the artists that you work with. This kind of patronage changes history, and the people who do this become immortal. And this immortality is why we're standing here today, discussing Diaghilev and the lives that he intersected, the crossed fates, the connections he made, the world he shaped, that we, and because you're with us today, you also all live in. We all are living in Diaghilev's world. And I, for one, am quite grateful for it. I hope that answers your question to some extent, Dmitry.
Да, Рома, очень обширно. Да, спасибо. Я как раз имел в виду больше твое, да, романтическое знакомство с Татьяной. Вот.
Yes, it was a lengthy and good answer. Actually, I was focusing more on your romantic relationship with Tatiana, but you have anticipated my next question, or rather two questions of mine. I was going to ask you, what is your vision of a perfect patron? You partially answered that. So let me give you just two questions at the same time. I never asked that before. Have you had a patron early in your career who would help you early on? Thank you.
So the perfect patron, and have I had a patron like that? I don't think that anybody who has a lifelong career as an artist gets there by themselves. And it is very important along the way that people understand you're trying to do something and become engaged and involved. And I've been very fortunate at various points, especially artists, their careers are not linear. They don't just go up in a straight line and arrive at some kind of plateau of stability. In fact, there is no stability and there is no plateau. Artists jump off a continuous series of cliffs, and they run up a constant range of mountains. They do not walk across an even plain. When you choose to become an artist, you understand that kind of easy, predictable life is not really where things are going to go for you. You rise and fall. You strive and fail. You strive again, fail less, and you keep striving until failures transform themselves into successes. Diaghilev understood this. He did not experience constant and consistent success. He understood that you pick yourself up after fiascos, that you do not let them shape your perception of what you're doing creatively, that you're always understanding that everything that goes wrong is how you learn and perfect. In fact, Diaghilev, when he was a young man, imagined a very different life. He thought he was going to be a musician, and he struggled to compose and present himself as a musician, famously courting Tchaikovsky and many others. And his attempts were not met with great success or appreciation. And he actually, at that point, understood that he had to take his impulses to categorize everything, because he was a great student of musical history, and turn it in another direction, which led him into curating art, and ironically brought him all the way back to theater. So he had this complicated life of success and failure and success and failure. And all artists have this, and I certainly had it. And I've had some wonderful patrons who have stepped in at certain key moments and invested in my career. But I have not had yet that patron of vision. I have wonderful friends who are with me in my struggle. And I, of course, now I have met Tatiana, who I described meeting at the Rites of Spring. And she also has created a circle of people who are also with me, looking at what art can do and how art can speak to our time. But this kind of superhuman figure, which Diaghilev represented, and there are many other examples in history, and one of the ones that I think of as the most amazing patron of all time was Lorenzo di Medici. And Lorenzo di Medici, he is the archetype of the grand patron. Not only was he able to take an amount of wealth, an amassing of wealth that is almost hard to imagine in our time. I think that they estimate that were he alive today, he would be by many orders of magnitude the most wealthy person in the world. He, in his time, had these incredible resources, but he was also with the artists that he supported, shoulder to shoulder with them, arguing philosophy, working at his poetry, trying his hand at all the arts. And he believed that arts were a window to some kind of greater story. And he saw for his beloved city of Florence that it could lead the world through ideas and through humanism, this concept about humanity, which was not stuck in the darkness of the Middle Ages, but was looking towards the light of the great classical periods. And he wanted to elevate the human soul through philosophy, through poetry, through incredible visual art. And this ability to husband resources and to also recognize great talent and collaborate with great talent and create projects for great talent gave us the high Renaissance. His sponsorship of Botticelli, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, these people, these artists, these geniuses were a gift to the entire world forever. And he, like Diaghilev, is still touching our lives. And so to get back to your idea of another like ideal patron, I would say that certainly Lorenzo di Medici, he would fit that bill. He would fit that that description. His grandfather, Cosimo de' Medici, said famously, and I will now mangle his quote, but that you live a life of purpose, and that purpose will define your life. And that is, I think, essentially like the credo of the Medici family. And it was certainly one that Lorenzo understood. He lived a life of great purpose, and he saw that purpose fulfilled. And he gave to us, as did Diaghilev, an incredible contribution to everything that came after, an incredible sense of we are still being touched by what he made happen. And that is grand patronage. I haven't experienced it yet, but I'm always open to working with people to find new ways to bring art out into the world. And I think even today, what we're doing here, those of you gathered at the Theater Museum and those of you online, we are all engaged in a form of patronage, in a form of looking at art, taking art into our lives, doing something with it, and taking something away from it so that we continue to keep this part of our humanity alive and relevant and shaping what comes next, because that is, after all, what art does. We are the weather vane of society. We point culture where it should go. And a culture can only rise and can only be as wonderful and sonorous and significant as the artists of its time are pointing it to be. So it is a great responsibility, not just for the artists, but for those around the artists who create this wonderful cocoon of support, ideas, and a way to rise out. I think many artists never really experience the kind of support that is needed to get ideas out. There is no shortage of great artists in the world, in any country, in any culture. Artists arise naturally, like mushrooms after the rain. They pop up. It's a natural activity for humans to do. But in order for artists to be more than just mushrooms popping up out of the ground, to actually turn into something more like, say, a mighty tree that stands over all of us and gives us protection and shade and is something we look to for years. In order for that to happen, you need really rich soil, you need patronage, you need support, you need a society that is understanding how important art is. So in a way, we focus on patrons. We focus on these individuals like Diaghilev because their lives are significant and signatory, but they need so many others involved as well. And one of the wonderful things about this exhibit is to take in the extent of the entourage of Diaghilev, how the cast of characters was large and deep and evolving. And you get this sense as you read over the story of Diaghilev about how he continuously was harvesting great talents out of Russia and combining them with great talents in Western Europe and constantly mixing this minestrone, this soup of geniuses. This is a wonderful thing. And one of the things that immediately touched my heart as I looked at all of these portraits and faces in the exhibit, and I hope after this talk that you all revisit the exhibit if you can, is this coming together, this idea that it was one person who led, who showed the way, but many who made up this time, this moment, this creative impetus. So.
Thank you, Romolo. We're having questions. We've got some questions. Anna, let's take some questions from the floor here because we have a microphone to share.
Wonderful.
Someone? Anyone? Before I start asking questions I got from the messengers, I'd like to revisit the 100 years back. Romolo, you mentioned that a few years ago, when you met Tatiana, you plunged deep when at Harvard in the atmosphere of 1913. Let's imagine it is happening now, and you are an artist on the Diaghilev's troupe, or maybe a sculptor, someone of the entourage, understanding what kind of person Diaghilev was. What would you say about his strengths and weaknesses of Diaghilev's? Thank you.
Well, Diaghilev's great strengths were his weaknesses. And I think that that's true of every significant creative person. An invulnerable artist or creative thinker is not actually open to learning from failure. And if you're not open to learning from failure, then it's really hard to break any new ground. Safety is the great killer of ideas and innovation. Risk is how things get done, and risk takers are the ones who do the making and the creating. Diaghilev was constantly leaping off a cliff. He was constantly taking chances. He was always improvising. It's interesting, I don't know how it works in Russian, but in Italian, impresario and improvisorio are very close words. To improvise and to be an impresario it's almost like a play on words. And Diaghilev's improvisation in the face of constant struggles with temperamental artists, financial reversals, political reversals. He would frequently have situations where at first he had the support of the Tsar, and then the Tsar would pull all the support out from under the production. Theaters would burn down. Innumerable and constant and consistent things were going wrong all the time. And Diaghilev managed through all of this to create this continuous stream of Ballet Russe productions, which were always remarkable and constantly challenging the audience and the entire world to think about how art, music, and dance could be envisioned. It's remarkable. So if you say, and now I've a little bit strayed off of the question, but what were his weaknesses? I think all of his things were weaknesses. He was a great collection of weaknesses, but he was a great emphasis on the word great collection of weaknesses. There was greatness in how he was weak, from his softness and fondness for beautiful young men, which led him to amazing young men who were remarkably talented, to his penchant for risk-taking, his desire to do things that probably were not well advised. He was lavish, he was temperamental. He really was an extraordinary collection of flaws. But it was this collection of flaws which came together to create the perfect person for what he set out to do. So that would be my answer.
Спасибо, Ромolo.
Thank you, Romolo. Let me say once again that you at the museum have the priority right of asking questions. Just raise your hand to get the microphone. We have a question from, we're receiving many questions. Natalia would like to know, what do you think, what was the initial impetus for Diaghilev being so energetical, the desire to create, or the plentitude of Russian talents, or something else? Thank you.
Well, there's a very interesting aesthetic philosophical book called The Shape of Time, which talks about, I think it was written in the late 60s or early 70s. It talks about, and forgive me, I don't remember the name of the author, but it talks about where the kind of striving genius that Diaghilev represented, how these types of people appear in cultures. And one of the attributes that is consistent is that you see them coming out of areas that are not the sort of cosmopolitan centers of their cultures. So Diaghilev actually was a bit of a country bumpkin, not to put down the people of Perm, but Perm was at the time a very remote city in Russia. It was on the edge of the Urals. It was a place that mainly was at one time a kind of way station for prisoners going to Siberia. It wasn't the large mining and manufacturing city that it's now become. It was much smaller, much more provincial. Diaghilev's father, his family had a concession in making vodka. They were, by Perm standards, gentry, but certainly by the standards of Moscow or St. Petersburg, they were not, major figures. And yet they had, from that position in Perm, where they were not so, there was not a lot of society to compete with, they had a kind of prominence. They celebrated, the father loved music. There was a great appreciation and feeling for culture of all kinds. And the family of Diaghilev, they were leaders culturally in this small little community. And this, I think, probably invested Diaghilev and his familial peers, because he did travel with, and stay with cousins and relatives when he went to St. Petersburg, it gave him a sense of already occupying a level that he didn't actually in Tsarist Russia occupy, of importance and significance. And when he got to St. Petersburg, he was striving. He was not complacent. He was not someone who had grown in luxury and comfortable in luxury and knew his place and understood his position in relationship to the nobility and to the wealthy people of St. Petersburg. And so he was a striver. And I think that this sense of being one who is not necessarily in possession of true validation from a culture or society or a caste system often pushes people. I would just say, I talked earlier briefly about Da Vinci and Michelangelo. Both of these artists came from very provincial backgrounds. Da Vinci, his father was a ragioniere, which means like an accountant and bookkeeper for important people in Florence, but they lived in the little town of Vinci, which if you ever go to Italy, is just a little hilltop village and actually pretty much still looks the same as it did in Da Vinci's time, this little medieval fortress village. And he grew up there with big dreams and went to Florence to realize them. Michelangelo, the same thing. His father was also, I think he was a notary, and he also had connections to people of importance, but he himself was not actually anything more than somebody who could write. And he was very disappointed in his son because he had aspirations for his sons that they should go into professions that were skills that used writing and knowledge. And he considered becoming a sculptor, that Michelangelo was essentially becoming like a mason. Like he was, really like a laborer. And it was a constant source of complications between Michelangelo and his father for his entire life, that his father, even though Michelangelo was the most highly paid artist in his time, that his father still sort of considered him and only begrudgingly acknowledged that his son was this, incredible thinker, but he was a thinker through stone. This was an evolving idea. So I could draw a million examples of this, of artists and thinkers and writers who came out of cultures which were not in the center. And a lot of times this creates some of the most thirsty for success and fame and recognition and significance, that they don't have a sense of place, that they strive for making an impact and essentially carving out of history a position for themselves that they did not get from birth. So that's my answer.
Ромо, спасибо.
Thank you, Romolo. And keep looking at you all, because for Romolo and myself, it is very important to have a lively audience. Live audience. I would very much like to have a question from the floor. Oh, we got one. Thank you. Good afternoon. I have two questions, and I would appreciate an elaborated answer. Except for Diaghilev's want of fame and love of arts, what else could have driven Diaghilev? And secondly, what was the interaction between Diaghilev and his time? What in the contemporary time served his purposes? Could it have been successful earlier than he did, in the late 19th century or maybe in the middle of the 20th century? What do you think? Thank you.
That's a complicated question. Thank you for it. I will try to honor it as well as I can. I'm not a historian, I'm an artist. And my interaction with art history and cultural history is essentially a tool that I use to understand things in my own work and what I'm going to do. So when I don't properly historically reference things, please forgive me. I am not a scholar. However, these things are fascinating to me, and I would say that Diaghilev was born in the era of Enlightenment, a time, or actually the end of the era of Enlightenment, a time when knowledge and systematic approaches to things were beginning to shape how people approach problems of the world. And he certainly, as a child of the Enlightenment, showed that in his notebooks, in his compendiums, even in his magazine that he created, the Art of the World. He constantly was gathering up. And this was a time when scientists would travel all over the world and gather ideas and create museums full of animals and stones, and really the world was being populated with knowledge, and it was being categorized and listed and understood. And Diaghilev came out of that. That was his background. That was what came before him. That was the time that he stood on. But that time of understanding was not a time of revolution. That was not a time of change. That was a time of stock taking. That was a time when they said, we have gotten to this point where we have the tools to understand what has happened and to put everything in its place. And then once you put everything in its place, what do? You break the place. And that was the 20th century. And Diaghilev was born in the 19th century, but he exploded in the 20th century. And he is one of the first active cultural instigators of this explosion. He was there. If you could think of him maybe like an orchestral conductor, that he came to the podium of an orchestra and the seats were filled with people who were part of that time. There was no Stravinsky before the 20th century. Stravinsky would have been impossible to imagine before the 20th century, because the idea of summarizing Western culture and then beginning to open up to African, Oriental, Asian, and all the other cultures of the world, and understand that you could have synthetic wholes. This was not something that was in the previous century. This was a 20th century idea. This idea of a global confluence of culture, that one thing could crash into the other and create an explosion, which, if you think about, not just in the arts, but also around this time, Einstein was sitting in Switzerland coming up with similar theories about molecular physics, that things could crash into each other and create transformative change. That this was an expression of this time, that we understood the atoms in the atomic principles of our history. We understood where things were and what they were. And then we had created this collection of things we understood what they were, and we brought them together. And then you get this new creative explosion. And you get another chapter in humanity's story about how things happen. So, no, I don't think that if he had been born 50 years earlier or 100 years earlier, that the time would have embraced him, or that he would have been able to shape his time. If he had been born 200 years or 400 years earlier, perhaps that would be a different story. I could see him in the court of the Sun King of France, or as an aide to the Borgia or Pope Julius, maybe doing incredible things. But in the preceding century, no, he would have been out of tune. He would have been that one instrument in the orchestra. He would not have been the conductor. He would have been the instrument that couldn't hold its key, that kept slipping. He was not for that time. He was for the 20th century. He was for a time of change, a time of disruption. One of the things I love to look at, as an artist myself, I draw inspiration not just from art and things related to culture. I like to look at other fields, and one of the interesting fields is evolutionary biology and evolutionary archaeology and anthropology. And one of the fascinating studies is of what's called punctuated equilibrium, that evolutions of very diverse things, whether you're talking about art or dinosaurs or periods of innovation in knowledge, they go through periods of disruption. And out of disruption comes invention, adaptation, and change. And then they achieve states of equilibrium where they are able to exist for a while and become defined and understood. And then just when that is beginning to, as we say, ossify, turn into something hard and completely immovable, there is new disruption. You can think, as another example, of the French Academy, which preceded Diaghilev's time, when the painting in France had become so controlled and what could be shown in salons so carefully understood that there was no room for breath, for air, for life. It is as if the art had become so wonderfully, hermetically sealed that it was essentially as if artists were engaged in the creation of mausoleums, tombs for dead ideas. And into this come the Impressionists and also figures like Rodin. In fact, Rodin famously, when he was a young man, he created this extraordinarily lifelike and vigorous sculpture called the Age of Bronze. And when he submitted it to the Salon, they threw it out. And it was so alive, so vital, that the only way that they could explain it, that it was possible to sculpt this way, was they said, oh, this is a life copy. This is a cast made from a living form. This is not an original sculpture at all. This is just like an anatomical model. And that wasn't true. The reason why that figure was so alive was because Rodin was willing to take chances and connect with real life and real life energy. And he did things that the sculpture was telling him to do, not what the academic rules were telling him to do. And there's a wonderful Rodin, much later figure in the Pushkinskaya Museum in Moscow. And it's a great example of this kind of thinking. If you go there, it's in the doorway where there's a group of large sculptures there, including William Zorak, Madonna and Child, a number of Mayol, I believe, very beautiful assemblage of sculptures. And there is this striding torso, and the part facing the audience, the part facing you out when you are in the lobby there looking at the sculpture, is a very understandably modeled anatomical figure, very powerful. But if you look around the back, the side that's towards the wall, you'll see there's this big, flat, strong plane. And I love that because I know what he did. He was trying to get the energy of the movement to come forward in that striding figure. And he took a block of wood and he slammed the clay with all his strength. And then he looked at it and he understood it was done. He did not take away the signs of his creation. He moved the entire front of the torso forward, lifted it up from the impact, and left the sign of how he did it as a kind of Rosetta Stone for artists who would look at it and come after. And one of the things you need to know about all art is that artists are always creating secrets and hiding things that they're doing, but also sharing secrets. But they're often hidden. They're often encrypted in process or encrypted in presentation. And it takes the ability to connect with the artist, to connect with the creation, to understand what they were doing, to unlock those secrets. And one of the wonderful things about studying things in time is going back and understanding how people worked and what they were doing when. And so Rodin is a good example in that he could have only been in his time, that he could have only been then because he was breaking something as Diaghilev was breaking something. And in order to break that thing, it has to be there to be broken. Because until it is formed and finished, it can't be shattered. So there are those who create the work of enclosing, and then there are those who come after who create the work of breaking. And this dynamic of enclosing and breaking and enclosing and breaking creates the story of culture and drives us forward. And we are always in this continual process in so many different ways of creating, enclosing, and breaking. Hope that answers your question. Thank you for it. Lovely question.
Да. На самом деле я...
Right. Actually, I was going to add a little bit to what Romolo said. I was thinking while you were talking, I agree with Romolo that Diaghilev was the man of his times, and the Russian seasons would have existed anyway because of state orders, state money, but there would have never been something of the kind like Diaghilev did with the entourage of great artists and what he did, because quite soon Diaghilev rode the wave, but very soon the time began to overstrip Diaghilev. He started to lag behind the times. In the 1920s, for instance. We have another interesting question. What books would you recommend to read on Diaghilev? Let me answer this myself. As I was getting prepared for this session, I browsed through 3 books, and I would recommend just one of those. That's Serge Lifar's memoirs. Serge Lifar was Diaghilev's friend and dancer on his troupe. Diaghilev's sister gave all the belongings of Diaghilev to Serge. Romolo may have his own preferences, of course. And what are your preferences, Romolo?
Well, I think Lifar is probably the best reference, but I would say that from what I have read, for somebody who would like to create a piece of fascinating historical writing, this is a very rich field that has not been properly addressed yet. It's at least not in English or English translation that I could find, or in Italian. It is, I think, what they would call a blue ocean from my point of view outside of Russia. Maybe in Russia there is a better writing about it. But it is certainly, I don't think that any great historical writer has tackled yet Diaghilev's life. And it would be wonderful if somebody did. I have read a number of books that I think are very dry and are very categorical and fascinating in the sense of how un-Diaghilev-esque they are. And I would have loved to have read this book that was invested not just with the facts of his life, but with the energy of his life. And I have not seen that book yet, although I would love to read it when it's written.
Возвращаюсь. Слышно меня, да? Здрасте.
Good afternoon. Getting back to the question about the cycles in the creation and destruction, the current period in time, what kind of cycle we're in? Can a patron like Diaghilev appear nowadays? What do you think? Thank you.
I think there's always opportunities for people of vision to shape their time. They are always different opportunities, and time is constantly changing. We are also in a period right now of tremendous change globally, societally. We are also in a period of disruption. It is very clear to anybody who's paying attention that a lot of the things that were presumed as fairly constant and reliable throughout the last 100 years are no longer so. And it doesn't take, it's not surprising for anybody to now, I think, understand that the environment is changing, that a lot of presumed political stabilities are changing, that the energies and the flow of resources is changing in the world, that it is a moment of change. And these moments, you know, it is a Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. We are living in interesting times, and so did Diaghilev. He lived in interesting times. He was, he harnessed that change. He survived it. He was also hurt by it. You know, going back to the previous question, could Diaghilev have, you know, would something along the lines of the Belarus existed without Diaghilev? I do disagree. I do not think it would have. I think that there was a great tradition in Russia. The state-sponsored tradition of ballet and music was remarkable. It had remarkable talents around it. Tchaikovsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, all these other, Mussorgsky, Rachmaninoff, they all came out of that state-sponsored culture. But the ability to take even classical, you know, what considered, Diaghilev would even take ballets and music that was considered accepted and traditional and turn it into something that was revolutionary, especially when he did his performances in London, where he tended to create a repertoire which was more traditional than what he would do in Paris. It still was, for the English, you know, it got them excited. He always brought that sense of danger and a little bit of not knowing where things were going to everything he did. And it is true that at the end of his life, he had lost the flame, that he had lost the ability to shock and change. But he had done his work. He had done what he needed to do. He himself frequently is recorded as saying that everybody has just a moment in time, and he famously talked about this with Fokine, and even about Nijinsky, that they had their moment and then their moment was past. And he was very ready to understand that he could put down one great talent and pick up another. And he had to have known that the rules, the physical rules of his creative universe applied not just to others, but also to him. And obviously he died from complications from diabetes, and that he wasn't, you know, that it wasn't any way directly connected to what was happening with him creatively. And it did come a bit suddenly when he did die, but it's as if in a way he knew maybe deep inside, it's like he had done what he was put on this earth to do. and he could put down his pince nez and his top hat and say goodbye. So does that, I guess that's what I would say about that.
Рома, мне кажется, ты до конца не ответил на этот вопрос.
Romolo, I think you have not finished answering that question, but actually before this session, I had been thinking about that myself, because part of my life relates to the juncture between culture and business. I'm turning to Lisa, that was her question actually. And now, 100 years since, the role of the patrons has been taken over by corporations. So it seems, and I see people from museums here, and if we look at no advertising, if we just talk about VTB or Gazprom, understandably, Gazprom does not support culture as opposed to the bank VTB, Russian bank VTB. So maybe the role of a particular person, Mr. Kostin at VTB, is very important. For instance, Credit Suisse does it all the time. It's part of their DNA. Whatever happens in business, they're going to support culture and arts. While in closer to Russian home, it's only up to the corporations, and it's all up to the top leader of the corporation. This is what I think about whether or not some patrons could emerge in this time here.
I would like to respond to that comment, Dmitry, before we move to the next question, that I'm not especially familiar with a lot of the major art collecting and corporate figures in Russia. However, I do notice certain activities, and one person who catches my attention is Dasha Zhukova, who is in her own way, I think, doing something closer to, and I think promising in the spirit of grand patronage, because I see her projects as not just collecting art. In other words, evaluating patronage purely on financial and transactional terms is, while yes, we all need money, it's not so important. What is important is engagement culturally, and to create essentially places where there is a platform for art to emerge from, where things can come from, that you're not just saying, okay, you and you and you are important, you're important artists, here's, you know, $1 million for you and $1 million for you, and I'm going to buy this Botticelli portrait and I'm going to put it in this museum and everybody's happy and goodbye, and now I'm going to do something else. But rather to build structures where people can engage with art, artists can engage with the structures, artists can engage with the process, and you can build things forward. It's never about what just happened. It's not even always about what is happening now. Patronage is about what could happen. Grand patronage makes what could happen happen. Patronage that's financial just pays for what already happened. The future is the part that makes patronage important, and that requires vision, and you have to be a visionary, and you have to be doing things that put you in the middle of it. And I was thinking about this in St. Petersburg, this project for New Holland, and I understand, I haven't seen it yet, but I'm looking forward to seeing it, that one of the structures includes Peter the Great's forge, where Peter the Great was another interesting patron, and when he wasn't building an entire city out of a swamp, he also loved to carve wood and do things with his hands. He was, in his own way, in his own time, a very hands-on and involved person. He looked over everything that was done. Nothing happened, whether it was a building or a garden in St. Petersburg, that he wasn't aware of and didn't look into. He was, in a sense, the grand schematic architect of the city. And he also had this personality where he liked to do things with his hands. And in New Holland is this structure where he would work and where work for him was done. And I think it's interesting because I love these kinds of cross-temporal resonances where something had a connection at one point and has a connection again. And what Zhukova is doing about creating these art centers in Moscow with the Garage and now in St. Petersburg with New Holland, this is my idea of how you create grand patronage and you make cultural change in a society and you harness the disruptive power of ideas and artists. You create the platform, that just the money doesn't create the platform. You have to create a place from which people can interact, learn, and grow. So, you know, I don't know the figures at BTB or Gazprom or what they do or what they own or what they've collected or what they fund. And I'm sure they have wonderful programs, and it's important for corporate programs to exist and for there to be avenues of funding for art. But what would really be enlightened is for the executives in these programs to not just see art as acquisition, but to understand that they also can learn from art, that art informs great people, that by embracing artists and their ideas and the natural necessity of invention and interpretation of the age, which is required of an artist to just simply survive, that they would bring to themselves more than the value of the artwork they made, that they would bring to themselves the value, and to their corporations and to their foundations and their organizations, they would bring to them the value of living artists, which is something that is ephemeral and also cannot even be truly put a price on. And this is what Diaghilev understood. And this is what everyone can learn from Diaghilev. So sorry to run away with this question, but I had this thought in response to what you were saying.
Да, спасибо, Татьяна.
Right, thank you, Tatiana. Thanks a lot. I'm from the Kunstkamera, the museum founded by Peter I that Romolo mentioned. I fully agree with you that Peter I was the great patron himself. As a follow-up to your thought, who are today's patrons, and are there great patrons nowadays? One would could argue with you about whether or not Dasha Zhukova is a great patron. Let's wait and see what are the results of her. Would you name a couple of other European great patrons of today, if there are any? And what do you think during this time of change that we're living through, and all those very different things that we couldn't have imagined even 20 years ago because of all this online thing, patronage, could it become online, virtual? What do you think about it? Going from offline into online. Thank you.
Well, it's another interesting and difficult question. Thank you very much. Yes, I agree with you to start with that it is yet to be seen what will come of these efforts of Zhukova, that we who live in a time don't get to judge that time, that we merely get to be that time. And it is for those who come after us who will be able to say whether or not something was or was not. In fact, there is no period in history that is not, if you read the history and the criticism and the analysis of the time, just really horribly myopic and frequently completely wrong. You know, I'm very interested and very engaged in Italian art history. Obviously, this is important to me. So I like to draw examples out of Italy. And one of my favorite examples is if you go to the Bargello in Florence, and you stand in front of it, and by the door there's a reproduction of Michelangelo's David. One time that was the actual sculpture, which is now at the l'Accademia delle Belle Arti, the Academy of Fine Arts, up the street. And next to it is it's a fountain. It's a big Neptune-like fountain. This is by a sculptor whose name was Amanamanti. And at the time, he was the celebrated sculptor of Florence. He was the star. He was the artist that everybody was compared against in sculpture. We do not even know his name unless you are deeply engaged in Italian Renaissance art history. He is forgotten. And he's there in the center of this major piazza where 1 million tourists stream through constantly. Everybody looks at his work and nobody sees it. And yet in his time, he was applauded and celebrated. And I think that for me to venture about who is important and who is not important right now in our time would, first of all, I'm not a great student of that kind of information, but also I don't think that my evaluation of individuals is particularly valuable because I am living in the time, and I'm also looking out at these people and wondering, I think that we're in an interesting time in that I see not so much that it's about patronage as it's about synthetically understanding how to work with art and how to bring art together. And if I would say that there's somebody who's channeling the spirit of Diaghilev in that sense, this compendium idea about collecting and bringing together and bringing things that are not anticipated to be together into one, which is what Diaghilev did all the time. He was constantly combining music and art and dance that was not expected to be found together. I would say that that would be someone like the Dutch designer, decorator, and curator, Axel, and I'm really bad with Dutch names, Van der Weert. I don't know how to say his name, forgive me, but he has created some remarkable pavilions in Venice. He designs exhibits all over the world, and his work is really extraordinary. And if somebody has the correct pronunciation of his name, I'd be grateful. But that kind of synthetic thinking, I think, is more significant right now than, say, somebody who has just put, incredible sums into collecting art, of which there are, of course, many, and competing now centers of collecting from China to Europe to Asia to America. Everywhere there's large fortunes. People are amassing art, but I don't know that that's necessarily as important as bringing interesting art together. One of the things about Axel's work is that he is doing something I think is extremely important, is he's stock taking. He will take a piece of archaeological work from Egypt or Mesopotamia or ancient China, and he will combine it with a Lucio Fontana painting or some piece of arte povera or some expressionist work. It's completely, you never know what he's going to combine. And what he's able to do is draw the thread of connection, which is the spirit of creativity and the spirit of inventive thinking across periods of art and across different cultures, and connect all of them. Because one of the things about art, which sometimes gets lost in all of this talk about value and revolution and change and new schools of thinking, is that art is a language. And I say this to my students all the time. I say, art is the language of humanity before the Tower of Babel. Because art, you don't need to understand how to say it, we all naturally react to art. Art communicates to us without a Rosetta Stone, without a translation, without a dictionary. There are levels of understanding as in any language. So somebody who has no training, maybe has no significant intellectual education, may have one understanding of art than opposed to somebody who is deeply schooled and has read extensively and studied extensively. But they both have a reaction, and they both can read the language. Their understanding is different, as is any language, but the language is universally acceptable and accessible. And this aspect of art, of creating universal language, of speaking across cultures and tying periods and cultures together through art, is what great patronage does. It's what Diaghilev did. It's what Axel van der Hoort is doing. And this is what I consider significant, and who I would look to as a bellwether, as an indicator of what is going to be important when people look back at our time. Because we have lived through a period when there was revolution and change and innovation in art, and when even innovation in art became the reason for art being. In other words, all that was really interesting for many years was, what is the newness? What is the novelty? What rules are we breaking? And we've kind of gone past that very, as you would, Marxist kind of idea about art as being essentially tied to a progress of history, that there is a direction for art, there is direction for history. We now live in a time when we are directionless, when things are moving in circles, and we no longer say, well, this has to come after that, and this has to come after that, after that. And it's taking stock of this moment in time when progress is no longer the discussion and linearity is no longer the direction. When we live in a time of circles, that is when you need someone like Axel. And this is also what Diaghilev, his exhibit, when I looked at it, I was just, oh, this is wonderful, because it's this series of circles, and this idea of circle of fates, and this idea of circular connections and cross connections and overlapping circles. I think this is what it's all about. So if you're looking to who is important right now, look to who's creating circles.
Прервать. Вот. У нас есть еще вопросов 5, а времени мало. Поэтому...
Sorry, I have to interrupt you because we have some 5 questions left and we have very little time left.
Okay.
So this is going to be a blitz now. Please be brief in answering these questions. Because we have some questions received online, and I want them to receive answers to their questions. Our next question is, what do you think? What critics said was destroying Diaghilev, or was it an impetus for him to move forward?
Well, Diaghilev is famous for responding to critics and often actually creating worse situations for himself. A lot of the things that he did in response to criticism, both at the court of the Tsar and in the press and elsewhere, created worse situations. But as I said earlier, these failures are actually some of the things that drove his greatness. So the French philosopher Rousseau described a sensation which he called l'esprit d'escalier, which is the spirit of the staircase, where Rousseau, who was not good at speaking publicly, who was not comfortable in society, would go to these salons in Paris, and there would be these other great thinkers of his time and great philosophers, and he would get hammered and he would get really destroyed in the arguments and the discourse. And he would always leave really feeling ashamed and upset. And as he walked down the staircase, he would formulate the arguments he wished that he had made, but didn't. And of course, this led to his great writings in philosophy, however, for which we have to thank his regret. But Diaghilev did not know the spirit of the staircase. He was constantly firing off. And I think that that's a good difference between a Frenchman and a Russian. Diaghilev responded in real time to his criticism, and that created a lot of his problems, but those problems ultimately created successes. And I will try to keep that brief and stop right there.
Okay, thank you. What's the difference between a genius and a master?
A master knows how to do everything that their métier, what's the word in English, their field requires. A genius knows how to do the things they don't know how to do.
Отлично.
Great. Fantastic answer. One more. Does a creative person need to explain his creative work and promote his career, or you should only focus on your creative work? Thank you.
It is a great misfortune of arts in this age of communication that people are constantly asking artists to explain themselves. And every art in every era has its liabilities, and that is certainly one of this time. There's a famous painter here who said that if I could say it with words, I would have written it instead of painting it. And so we are always being forced to reformat now our thinking into verbal structures and constructs. But that is not where the work is coming from. So it is imperfect at best to verbalize visual ideas, just as any kind of artistic attempt to interpret music as visual ideas or words as art, or there's always, these are languages. And as anyone knows, things are lost in translation. When I read translations of Montale in English, it hurts me because so much is lost. I understand that as someone who does not have the ability to read Russian and understand it, that I will never really grasp the beauty of Lermontov, that it evades translation. Well, art evades translation, and we can translate it, and I can read Lermontov, and I can write to you about my ideas in art, or read the writings of other artists talking about art. But essentially, you have to understand, you're reading a translation. If you want to know what someone thinks, and it's important to you, learn to speak their language.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
От Елены из Москвы.
Yelena from Moscow is asking, all your works are impetus of life and love. In today's world, there is a chaos of notions of good and bad, good and evil. How you would, what kind of message you would leave to the young generation who are only starting to live independently?
The question of good and evil is a very interesting one, and a problem that Nietzsche confronted many years ago. And he came away with this idea that good and evil is a low concept, that it is a simplistic understanding of how the world turns. And when I read this philosophy as an art student many years ago, it meant one thing to me. But now, living in a very complicated time, I have a different understanding of it. That good and evil belong in everything, and everything has good and evil. And essentially, it is dangerous to ignore evil, just as it is unrealistic to only see the good. What we do with good and evil is we understand that we live in this yin and yang, that we live in this duality, and that what enriches a life is the ability to channel positive things out of negative, to see how, let me put it to you this way, that there is a lot of black and white thinking, that somebody is right and somebody is wrong. We're not living in a time when there is a lot of understanding of middle ground, and there is not a lot of spirit of compromise. Politics are becoming more radical. Movements everywhere are becoming more radical. There are increasing directions of what we call tribalism in human society right now. And the thing about tribes is that tribes can only control limited areas because they can only communicate with the other members of their tribe. And great moments in human history break down tribal walls and tribal barriers. And I personally believe that what we do in our lives and how we approach our lives shapes who we are as people. And I do not pretend that I am a good person, and I hope that I'm not a bad person. I am a person. Like Diaghilev. Was Diaghilev good? He was a bit evil. But even that evil, he was able to make be a good thing. So I hope in my worst, I'm still good. And in my best, I am not naive to the power of the bad. That's the complicated nature of humanity.
Тут есть вопрос почему-то ко мне.
We have a question to me somehow, and then I have another question to you, Romolo. Dmitry,
Okay,
what's the point of you doing all this? I don't know what the asker meant, Romolo or supporting the culture or what? The author of the previous question about good and bad, good and evil, as Romolo was answering, I started to think maybe the very essence of a human being, what we are, this mixture of good and bad, good and evil, and this impetus that Romolo partially mentioned, what we have more, and the impetus is channeling through me. Maybe if something good is going through me, I can share it with the world. Romolo is having his exhibition this year in St. Petersburg in March, I hope, because my Spanish friend is going to have his exhibition, the masterpiece of masterpieces. He took well-known masterpieces, taking away all the characters, the Venus, Botticelli's Venus without the Venus, and something other kinds. Interesting exhibition, and maybe we're going to show it in the regions. I can remember from last year, I went to Buryatia, the city of Ulan-Ude, and I met the director of the local museum. And she said she had a dream to bring in Goya to Ulan-Ude. And we hope that we would succeed, that Goya's graphics would come to Ulan-Ude next year, or maybe this year. So I hope that this is doing something good for this world. This is the point of our doing this. I hope I have answered that question from the floor. I also have a question of Romola, because we have to wind up. And whoever has a very good vision, you see Studio Romola, etc. Romola has created a foundation of his Del Deo family. And let me ask you the final question, a personal question of you, Romola. What's the point for you to have created this foundation? Thank you.
Well, okay. So like many artists, I don't stand alone. I stand on the shoulders of those who came before me. And I'm interested in those who can come after me. And in this time, in order to make things, to preserve, protect, and carry forward into the time after me, it is important to create structures that function in this time. And one of those is to create a foundation. And arts foundations are well suited for this idea. And with this foundation that I created, I am bringing emerging artists, young artists, to come and work with me and be able to be here and experience what I have to offer as a teacher. And also, I am at the same time working with the archives of my predecessors and my own to create an ability so that in the future, others can come and study these things. Because whether or not someone considers what I do important, or what my father did important, or my grandmother important, these various artists in my family tree, all art is important in the sense that it is part of this bigger story. And how our story is connected to the bigger story could provide insights and use. Many of the names that we have been looking at in the Diaghilev Circle of Fates are extremely famous, but others are only known to scholars of the material. They're all part of that story. They're all in their own way important. And the ability of the museum to find these drawings and these portraits and to find these archives and bring this material together was a great effort. And the existence and the protection of this information allows for future exhibits like the exhibit that we have today for Diaghilev to exist, and for these stories to be told. And so the Del Deo Foundation for the Arts is one small effort in a bigger story, one small line of poetry in a longer poem about what is happening in our time. And I am trying to, in my way, preserve, protect, and pass on to another generation that little piece of our time.
Да. Ромула, спасибо.
Right, Romola, thank you very much. I thank the audience, the visitors, our online audience as well, who have been with us from various social networks. I thank the director, Natalia Metelitsa. I thank Anna for the invitation, for inviting Romola and myself to speak here. Romola, I thank you, and I thank our translator, Boris Rubinstein. Romola, just one final remark from you, if you are willing to say it.
Well, I would also say thank you to you, Dmitry, for being the catalyst behind this, our own personal Diaghilev. And Dmitry is a cultural diplomat, and he travels the world, and he carries, like Diaghilev did, the energy and the spirit of Russia everywhere and excites us with projects and brings us back to Russia to work together and to create possibilities together. And this is a beautiful thing and a necessary thing. And you had a question, Dmitry, why do you do it? I don't know why you do it, but grazie, I'm so glad you do. I'm so happy that there are people out there like you who are engaged in reaching out to artists, in reaching out to museums, in talking to all these various people involved in art and bringing us together and starting these conversations. And all of you who came today to the museum and all of you online who have taken the time in your evening to spend some moment sharing with us these thoughts about Diaghilev, sharing your questions and engaging. This is what cultural diplomacy is about. And this is how we carry the conversation forward. So I just want to express my gratitude and my appreciation to all of you and to the museum for allowing this to happen. And I hope that this is not a single flower, a single rose in a vase, standing alone in a room, but actually a plant growing in a soil, which is going to spread more seeds. And I urge all of you to think and to move forward and create these seeds, spread these seeds out. Because if we don't do it, we cannot assume that others will. Each of us in the world has to have agency to connect and be our own cultural diplomats. So I thank you, and I wish you all a wonderful evening. Buonasera.